Richard Lawson's mansion on Banana Island was less a home and more a monument to a grief that had no end. The marble floors gleamed with a sterile, cold light. The high ceilings and panoramic windows looked out onto the Lagos Lagoon, but no one saw the view anymore. Everything was a muted gray since the accident, a car crash on the Lekki-Ikoyi link bridge that had stolen his wife, Evelyn, and left their daughter, Amanda, in a silent, unmoving world. Amanda, 8 years old, sat in her custom-made wheelchair on the expansive terrace, a small, still figure against the backdrop of opulence. Her once bright eyes, the same shade as Evelyn's, were now empty and distant. She hadn't spoken a word, hadn't so much as smiled, since the day they brought her home from the hospital. The doctors called it post-traumatic mutism, a psychological paralysis brought on by shock, and it was compounded by the physical paralysis that kept her from walking. They had given up on hope, advising Richard to focus on therapy and acceptance. Richard Lawson, a titan of industry whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and unyielding ambition, felt powerless in the face of his daughter's silence. He had built an empire from nothing, but he couldn't build a bridge back to his own child. He spent his days in his home office, the click of his keyboard the only sound in the otherwise quiet wing of the house. He handled billion-dollar deals with the same cold detachment with which he now walked the halls of his silent mansion. He had everything money could buy, except the one thing he needed most, his daughter's voice, her laughter. He watched her from a distance, through the tall glass doors of his office. She was a beautiful ghost in her own home, a constant, painful reminder of everything he had lost. The silence had become a suffocating presence, filling every room, every moment. It was an elegant prison, trapping them both in a shared grief that no amount of wealth could overcome. He would have given it all away for just one laugh, one flicker of the joy that had once illuminated their lives. Then, one hot afternoon, a shadow slipped through the hedge. The boy's name was Kola. The name wasn't his real one, but it was the one everyone on the street knew him by. He was a whisper of a boy, all sharp angles and quick movements, with calloused feet and a patchwork of scars on his arms. He had been sent on an errand to a different mansion, but the guard, a burly man with a scowl, had chased him away. Hungry and desperate, he had spotted the Lawson mansion's high walls and a gap in the hedge. Curiosity, and the gnawing in his stomach, pulled him inside. He didn't know whose house it was. He only saw the vast, manicured garden and the lone, still figure on the terrace. The girl in the wheelchair looked like a beautiful doll, perfect and unmoving. He felt a strange pang of recognition, a connection to her stillness. He too had felt frozen by life, but he had learned to move past it, to dance through it. Kola had discovered the power of dance long ago. It was his language, his shield, his sword. On the streets, it earned him small coins and kept the bullies at bay. It was a way to tell his story without saying a word. In the Lawsons' pristine garden, with no audience but the silent girl, he began to move. He started with slow, fluid steps, his bare feet tracing patterns on the perfect grass. He spun and leapt, his body an extension of the rhythm only he could hear. The dance was a story of survival, of a sun rising over a broken city, of finding joy in the smallest things. He moved with a wild, unrestrained energy, his limbs a blur of motion. He didn't see the tears that welled in Amanda's eyes as she watched him. He only felt the music in his soul. Then, he did a final, exuberant spin and landed in a dramatic pose, a wide, genuine grin on his face. The sound that broke the silence was small at first, a soft, unfamiliar sound that no one in the house had heard in months. A giggle. Then another. And then, a full, unrestrained laugh, a sound so pure and unexpected it felt like music. Richard, buried in a spreadsheet in his office, froze. The sound was impossible. It was a melody from a forgotten lifetime. He looked up, his heart a hammer against his ribs, and saw through the glass doors his daughter, Amanda, her head thrown back, laughing. Richard flew from his office, the spreadsheet and the multi-million-dollar deal forgotten on his screen. He burst through the glass doors onto the terrace, his gaze fixed on Amanda. She was still laughing, a raw, beautiful sound that brought tears to his eyes. But then he saw the source of the impossible sound, a skinny, barefoot boy, standing in the middle of his garden. The laughter died on Amanda's lips as her father's imposing figure filled her line of sight. The boy, Kola, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, went rigid, his playful stance replaced by the guarded crouch of a cornered animal. Richard's mind, a fortress of cold logic and corporate strategy, couldn't process the scene. This boy, this intruder, had done what the best doctors and therapists had failed to do. He had made his daughter laugh. But the habit of a lifetime was hard to break. Richard saw only a trespasser, a street urchin who had no business on his private property. The years of building walls around his heart and his life meant his first instinct was to protect, to expel the unknown element. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Guards. Get this boy out of here." Kola flinched, his eyes wide with fear. He took a step back, ready to bolt, his brief moment of joy shattered. Amanda's laughter was gone, replaced by a fresh, panicked anguish. She had laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. Now, the one person who had made her feel something was about to be taken away. She looked from the terrified boy to her father's stony face, and a part of her, the part that had been dormant for so long, screamed. "Daddy, no," she cried, a voice so small and weak, but a voice nonetheless. It was the first time she had spoken since the accident. "Please. Don't send him away." Her words, the shock of them, stopped Richard dead in his tracks. He stared at her, then back at the boy. The raw emotion on her face, the desperation in her voice, was a revelation. He had almost forgotten what his daughter's voice sounded like. He had merely chased away the person who had brought it back. The silence that followed was charged, a moment suspended between fear and a fragile, newfound hope. He looked at Kola, really looked at him, and saw not an intruder, but a miracle. He saw a boy who had done the impossible. The guards, who had been alerted by his shout, arrived at the edge of the terrace. Richard raised a hand, stopping them. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew he couldn't let this moment, this boy, slip away. He looked at Amanda, her eyes fixed on him, pleading. The decision was not just his to make anymore. Richard dismissed the guards with a wave of his hand, his gaze still locked on his daughter. The sound of her voice, a fragile thread woven with pain and hope, had unraveled the years of grief that had hardened his heart. He walked to her, kneeling beside her wheelchair, and took her hand. "Amanda," he whispered, "you spoke." She nodded, tears tracing clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. Her eyes, so long vacant, were now full of life and a fierce plea. "Please, Daddy. He makes me happy." Richard looked at Kola, who stood frozen, still expecting the guards to reappear and drag him away. The boy's fear was palpable, a stark contrast to the carefree joy he had displayed just moments before. Richard saw the raw scars on his arms, the thin, hungry frame, and the wisdom in his young eyes, the wisdom of a child who had seen too much. An abrupt, life-altering decision formed in Richard's mind. He stood up, towering over the boy. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than it had been in years. "Kola," the boy mumbled, his eyes darting to the hedge. "Just Kola." "Kola," Richard repeated, a foreign name on his tongue. "You will stay. But under my rules. You will not leave the grounds. You will not speak to anyone about what happens here. You will eat, you will rest, and you will dance for her. The offer was a lifeline, a gilded cage. But for Kola, it was a mansion full of food and safety, a reprieve from the brutal struggle of the streets. He didn't hesitate. He nodded, a single, sharp motion. Richard called his head of staff, a prim and cautious woman named Mrs. Adele, and instructed her to find Kola fresh clothes and a meal. As the boy was led away, a strange hush fell over the garden. It was a different kind of silence now, not one of grief, but of anticipation. Richard watched as Amanda's eyes followed Kola until he disappeared inside. He knelt beside her once more, a profound sense of hope unfurling in his chest. "He's staying, Amanda," Richard said. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her body. Then, as she looked at her father, a tiny muscle in her right foot, a toe, twitched. Richard gasped. The doctors had told him to expect no movement, but in that moment, in that garden of impossible miracles, he saw the first sign of life. The streets of Lagos were a different world from the manicured lawns of Banana Island. They were a symphony of noise, a tapestry of struggle and survival. For Kola, they were home. As he sat in the Lawson Mansion's kitchen, devouring a plate of food that felt like a king's feast, his mind drifted back to the life he had escaped. He thought of his crew, a small band of street boys who shared food, a cardboard shelter, and a fierce loyalty. Their leader was a boy named Tund, a charismatic but ruthless kid who saw the world in terms of who you could take from. Kola had earned his place in the crew with his dancing, his ability to charm and distract people with his fluid movements. It was a skill that kept them fed, and it was a skill that Tund exploited. Tund had always seen Kola as a resource, a golden goose. Now, from the safe, sterile confines of the mansion, Kola felt a surge of guilt. He had left them without a word. He had stumbled into a life of unimaginable luxury while they were still out there, hungry. He worried about Tund's reaction when he realized Kola was gone. He was right to be worried. From the shade of a dusty mango tree across the street from the Lawson Mansion, Tund and two other boys watched. They had been trying to find Kola all day. They had heard whispers from the guards at other mansions, rumors of a new dancer, a boy with scars who had disappeared. Tund's eyes narrowed as he saw Mrs. Adele leading Kola through the ornate front gates. The mansion's high walls, the armed guards, and the pristine lawns were a world away from their reality. "Look at him," Tund hissed, his voice a mix of envy and fury. "He found a mark, a big one. And he didn't tell us." One of the boys, Femi, pointed to the guards. "We can't get in there, Tund." "We don't have to," Tund said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "He's not a ghost. He has to come out sometime. And when he does, he'll have a lot to answer for. That big house, that rich family, we'll get our share. One way or another." The shadows of the street had not let him go. They were watching, waiting, and they were about to remind Kola that his past was not so easily escaped. The arrival of Kola sent a ripple of unease through the mansion's staff. They were a finely tuned machine, each person with a specific role, each movement precise and predictable. The street boy was a wrench in the gears. The maids whispered in hushed tones as they saw his new, clean clothes, and the guards exchanged glances. He was a symbol of the outside world, a chaotic element that had been brought into their sanctuary of order and wealth. Mrs. Adele, the head of staff, viewed the situation with a mix of disdain and duty. She served Richard Lawson with absolute loyalty, but this boy was a gross deviation from the norm. She supervised him as he ate, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. She couldn't deny his effect on Amanda, but she couldn't trust him either. "He's a thief, a common vagrant," one of the junior maids whispered to a gardener. That evening, Richard brought Kola to the living room, a vast space with soaring ceilings and a grand piano no one played. Amanda was there, sitting in her wheelchair, her eyes sparkling with an anticipation that had been absent for months. "Dance," Richard commanded, his voice holding an unusual note of something akin to pleading. As Kola danced, Amanda watched, completely enthralled. The tension in her shoulders began to ease. She didn't laugh, but her face was alight with an expression of pure, unadulterated joy. When Kola finished, a soft, breathless sound escaped her lips. "When he dances," she whispered to her father, her voice still weak but clear, "I feel like I can move." Richard looked from his daughter to the exhausted boy, a cold dread washing over him. The connection between them was so profound, so unbreakable. He had made a pact he couldn't take back. What if this boy was the only thing holding his daughter together? What if he was the key to her recovery? The weight of that thought was heavier than any business deal he had ever closed. He had let a stranger into his life, into his home, and into his heart, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that this would change everything. The mansion, once a museum of grief, was now a place of silent, watchful hope. Richard watched Kola and Amanda from a distance, the dynamic between them a mystery he was desperate to understand. The boy, once a phantom of the streets, had become a fixture in their lives, his bare feet now accustomed to the polished floors. His dancing wasn't just a performance, it was a conversation, a silent language that only he and Amanda understood. He didn't just move, he told stories with his body, tales of triumph, of falling and getting back up, of a world filled with chaos but also unexpected beauty. One afternoon, Richard found them in the sun-drenched conservatory, a room filled with exotic plants that had once been Evelyn's passion. Kola was on the floor, doing a series of intricate, flowing movements that mimicked the growth of a plant from a seed. He was focused, his brow furrowed in concentration. Amanda sat in her wheelchair, her head tilted, a rapt expression on her face. Her eyes were no longer vacant, they were alive, following every graceful curve of his body. Then, as Kola reached a crescendo in his dance, his body unfurling like a blossom, something miraculous happened. Amanda, her gaze fixed on him, pushed her hands against the arms of her wheelchair. With a visible strain, she managed to lift her hips slightly off the seat, a movement so small yet so monumental. A gasp escaped Richard's lips, but he held his breath, not wanting to break the spell. Amanda held the position for a brief, agonizing moment before collapsing back into the chair, exhausted but triumphant. A small, proud smile touched her lips. Kola, oblivious to Richard's presence, finished his dance with a gentle flourish. He looked at Amanda and smiled. "You're getting stronger, Amma," he said, using the nickname he had given her. Richard felt a wave of emotion wash over him, a powerful cocktail of relief, gratitude, and awe. He had brought in every specialist, every machine, every therapy money could buy, and none of it had worked. But this boy, with his scars and his spirit, was doing the impossible. He was chipping away at the fortress of his daughter's paralysis, both physical and emotional. Richard began to see hope. Not the false, fragile hope of a desperate man, but a real, tangible possibility. A path had been cleared through the darkness, and it was paved with the simple, joyful movements of a street boy. The doctors had told him to give up, to accept the reality of her condition. But in the quiet moments in his home, he was seeing a new reality being born, a reality where anything was possible. He knew he had to protect this boy, this fragile spark of hope, at all costs. Richard Lawson's world was a delicate balance of power and reputation. His business partners, powerful men in their own right, operated in a sphere where perception was everything. A few weeks after Kola's arrival, Richard's phone rang. It was David Morgan, his most trusted and influential partner. "Richard," Morgan's voice was sharp, devoid of his usual corporate pleasantries. "We need to talk." This whole circus has gone on long enough. Richard's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what Morgan was referring to. The whispers and rumors about the street boy and his mansion had reached the highest echelons of his business world. They met at a sterile, glass-walled conference room in Richard's downtown office. Morgan was there with a grim-faced man named Peter, a rival who had recently invested heavily in Richard's company. They didn't waste time on pleasantries. "The board is concerned," Morgan began, his voice low and serious. "This charity case is affecting our image. The media is circling. They're calling you a humanitarian, a philanthropist. This is a distraction, Richard. Our clients want stability, not emotional gestures." Richard's jaw tightened. "This is a private matter. My family." "Your family is now a public spectacle," Peter interrupted, his tone laced with malice. "You have $1 billion deal on the table with the government. Do you think they want to partner with a man whose judgment is being questioned? A man who takes in vagrants and lets them run wild in his home?" The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He had built his empire on a foundation of cold, calculated decisions. Sentiment was a weakness. For the first time, he felt the precariousness of his position. They were right, he was putting his personal life before his business. But how could he not? Amanda was 1,000,000 times more important than any deal. "He's not a distraction," Richard said, his voice hard. "He's helping my daughter." Morgan sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Richard, we understand your grief. We all do. But you have a responsibility to your company, to your partners. You're becoming a liability." He locked eyes with Richard, and the unspoken threat hung in the air. "If this boy stays, we walk. We sell our shares. And the company will fall." It was an ultimatum. A clear choice between his daughter's fragile hope and the empire he had spent a lifetime building. The silence in the room was deafening, the air thick with tension. The stakes had just been raised, and Richard knew, with a sinking feeling, that the game had just begun. The news of the street boy and the Lawson mansion didn't stay contained within the high-walled world of boardrooms and corporate whispers for long. It leaked, a trickle at first, then a flood. A junior staff member, disgruntled by the sudden shift in the mansion's routine, sold a story to a local tabloid. The headline blared across the city: "Barefoot street boy saves billionaire's daughter." The story, a mix of half-truths and sensationalism, painted Richard as an eccentric philanthropist and Cola as a magical, almost mythical figure. The public, starved for good news in a city often defined by its struggles, ate it up. They saw a modern-day fairy tale, a story of wealth meeting poverty, and of hope triumphing over despair. Richard's phone didn't stop ringing. Journalists, talk show hosts, and even a few documentary filmmakers wanted an interview. They wanted to know the boy's story, to see the miracle for themselves. Richard, a man who had always guarded his privacy fiercely, found himself at the center of a media storm. He ignored the calls, but he couldn't ignore the change in the atmosphere. When he drove to his office, he saw people pointing at his car. The guards at the mansion reported a growing number of reporters loitering at the gate. The city watched. And it wasn't just the media. The street boys, Tun's gang, saw the headlines and laughed. They had always known Cola was a good dancer, but they never imagined his talent would land him in a mansion and turn him into a celebrity. Tun saw not a miracle, but an opportunity. The boy who had run away from them was now a public spectacle, and his new, wealthy family was a target. One day, as Richard returned from a tense meeting, a flash of light caught his eye. He looked up, and on a building across from his gate, he saw them. Paparazzi cameras, a row of long lenses pointed directly at his home, their flashes a silent, predatory rhythm. They were watching, waiting for a single misstep. Richard felt a cold fear grip him. He had protected his daughter from the world of business, from the public eye. Now, because of Cola, she was exposed, her fragile recovery a subject of public debate. He drove into his compound, the gates closing behind him, but he knew they were no longer safe. The outside world had breached the walls, and the danger was not just to his reputation, but to the very happiness they had so recently found. The media circus and the business threats faded into the background for a single, pivotal moment when a new doctor arrived at the Lawson mansion. Dr. Anya Sharma was a renowned neurospecialist, her reputation built on her no-nonsense approach and a near-miraculous success rate with trauma patients. Richard had hired her as a last resort, desperate for a professional opinion that wasn't tainted by his own hope. He had briefed her on Amanda's condition, the paralysis, the mutism, the psychological block. He had, however, omitted one crucial detail: Cola. Dr. Sharma's examination was thorough and clinical. She observed Amanda's reflexes, tested her nerve responses, and reviewed her past medical charts. Amanda, typically withdrawn and unresponsive during medical checkups, surprised Richard by being more present, more alert. She even offered a small smile when Dr. Sharma asked her a question about a book she was reading. Richard saw it as a sign of progress, but he didn't dare say it out loud. After the examination, Dr. Sharma pulled Richard aside. Her face was a study in professional skepticism, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. "Mr. Lawson, her charts show no physical reason for the paralysis. There are no signs of spinal cord damage. Her condition is almost entirely psychological." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. "So, there's no hope?" "On the contrary," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "There is. I've never seen a case where the psychological block has begun to break so quickly. She has better muscle tone than I would have expected, and her emotional responses, they're active. Something is happening, something positive." Just then, Cola walked into the room, a tray of juice glasses in his hands, an impromptu delivery he had decided to make. Dr. Sharma's eyes fell on him, taking in his worn clothes and his confident, almost joyful demeanor. Amanda's face lit up. "Cola," she said, her voice a little stronger than before. Dr. Sharma watched the interaction with keen interest, her clinical detachment giving way to professional curiosity. She didn't ask who the boy was, but she understood everything. She watched as Amanda's eyes followed his every move, the way her body seemed to relax in his presence. She saw the unspoken bond, a connection stronger than any therapy or medication could create. She turned to Richard, her expression now a mix of wonder and stern instruction. "Whatever you're doing," she said, her voice firm and decisive, "don't stop." The words were a powerful validation, a lifeline thrown to him in the face of all the doubt. The doctor, the one person he had trusted to give him a cold, hard dose of reality, had just confirmed his greatest hope. Life in the mansion had settled into a fragile, beautiful rhythm. Cola would spend his days with Amanda, his dancing and his stories a constant source of joy for her. He would help her with her physical therapy, and in return, she would read to him from her favorite books, a trade of worlds and knowledge. The mansion, once cold and silent, was now filled with the low hum of their shared laughter. One hot afternoon, Richard had a meeting in his home office, so Cola decided to go to the kitchen to get a drink. He was making his way through the opulent, sun-drenched hallway when the back door, a heavy-set service entrance, opened. A shadow detached itself from the bright sunlight and entered the house. It was Tund. He wasn't alone. Two other boys from his gang stood behind him, their faces a mixture of awe and resentment. Tund's eyes, cold and hard, swept over Cola's clean clothes and the spotless marble floors. "So this is it, Cola?" Tund said, his voice a sneer. "This is where you've been hiding? A palace?" Cola's heart hammered against his ribs. The fear he had pushed down, the fear of his past catching up to him, was now standing right in front of him. Tund, I can explain. Explain what? Tund interrupted, taking a menacing step forward. That you found a rich family to take care of you and forgot all about us? We're a family, Cola. We share everything. The food we get, the money we make, the secrets we keep. Cola backed away, his hands held up in a placating gesture. This isn't what you think. I'm not a kept boy. I'm helping them. Tund laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. Helping them? No. You're a prize. A golden goose. And we're here to collect. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. We know everything, Cola. We know the girl is a miracle. We know you're the one making her walk. The whole city knows. The tabloids can't stop talking about it. He leaned in, his face inches from Cola's. Now, you're going to give us a cut. You're going to pay us to keep quiet. Because if you don't, we'll go to the media. We'll tell them the truth. That you're not a hero, you're just a common street boy who stole from them. We'll ruin you. The threat was a poison arrow aimed directly at the heart of Cola's new life. Tund's eyes held a cold, ruthless glint that promised he would do exactly what he said. The easy rhythm of life in the mansion was a lie, the past had found him. He was trapped between two worlds, and the one he had left was demanding its price. Tund and his boys slipped out of the mansion as quickly and quietly as they had entered, leaving Cola in a state of shock. He was a prisoner now, held hostage by the very past he had tried to escape. The easy smiles and whispered conversations with Amanda were now laced with a new, terrifying tension. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, his dance steps less fluid, his movements more cautious. The rest of the mansion's staff sensed the change. The initial whispers of skepticism had been replaced by a quiet admiration for the boy who had brought life back to the Lawson family. But now, with Cola's sudden withdrawn demeanor, a new division formed. Mrs. Adele, the head of staff, had grown to grudgingly respect Cola. She had seen the profound change in Amanda and couldn't deny his positive influence. She saw the worry in his eyes and felt a protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. She approached him in the kitchen one evening. Is everything all right, Cola? She asked, her voice softer than usual. Cola shook his head, unable to speak. He couldn't tell her about Tund, about the threat, the fear of having his new family's safety jeopardized. But not all the staff were so kind. One of the junior housekeepers, a young woman named Zara, had always been resentful of Cola. She saw him as an intruder, a boy who had been given everything without earning it. She had been listening in on his conversation with Tund, hidden behind a large vase in the hallway. She had heard enough to know the boy had secrets, and that he was being threatened. To her, it confirmed all her worst suspicions. He wasn't a hero, he was a liability, a threat to the peaceful, well-ordered life of the mansion. The divide deepened. On one side, there were those who had witnessed the miracle of Amanda's recovery and felt a deep loyalty to Cola. On the other, there were those who saw him as a harbinger of trouble, a threat to their own secure lives. Zara's quiet surveillance of Cola intensified, and she began making phone calls, her voice hushed, her words carefully chosen. Later that evening, in the grand living room, the tension reached a breaking point. Richard was on the phone, a furious argument with his business partners, his voice low and strained. Amanda was in her wheelchair, a blanket over her lap. Cola, restless and anxious, stood by the window, watching the moonlight on the lagoon. Suddenly, Amanda called out to him. Cola, dance for me, she pleaded, her voice filled with a desperate need for the normalcy that had been stolen. Kola began to move, a slow, hesitant dance filled with his own fear and pain. As he moved, his focus shifted from his own anxiety to her unwavering trust. The dance grew more confident, more powerful. He danced a story of strength, of courage in the face of fear. As he was in the middle of a complex move, Amanda, with an almost impossible burst of strength, pushed herself out of her wheelchair. Her legs, unaccustomed to bearing her weight, trembled violently. But she held on, standing for a brief, glorious moment. The sight was breathtaking. The room fell silent. Richard ended his call and stared, his face a mask of disbelief. Amanda was standing. For the first time since the accident, she was on her own 2 feet. The sight of Amanda standing was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, a private miracle witnessed by a few. But in the age of instant media, no miracle stays private for long. Zara, the resentful housekeeper, had a phone, a contact at a major news outlet, and a story she believed would make her famous. She sent a grainy, shaky video she had secretly recorded of Amanda standing, along with a sensationalized account of Kola's presence and her own dark suspicions. The video went viral within hours. The headlines exploded across every platform. Millionaire's daughter walks again, thanks to a street boy. A miracle on Banana Island. Is this kindness, or madness? The narrative was an intoxicating mix of hope, human interest, and class warfare. The public was captivated. They saw Richard Lawson, the ruthless tycoon, being humbled by a boy from the very streets his businesses often ignored. The media painted Kola as a symbol, a modern-day saint, while Richard was cast as a man who had everything and was now, finally, learning the true meaning of wealth. Richard, however, saw the headlines with a cold sense of dread. The public's adoration was a fragile thing, easily turned. The more they celebrated Kola, the more they scrutinized his own motives. His business partners, infuriated by the unwanted publicity and the direct challenge to their ultimatum, began making moves. Richard's phone buzzed constantly with calls he refused to take. The company's stock, once stable, was now volatile, a direct reflection of the public's chaotic opinion. Kola, for his part, was completely overwhelmed. He had gone from a life of anonymity to being the face of a national media sensation. He saw a news report on a TV in the kitchen, a picture of his own face plastered on the screen. The news anchor spoke of him with reverence. He felt a profound sense of unease. He knew who he was, a boy who danced to survive. He was not the hero they made him out to be. His fear of Tund intensified. Tund and his crew were not just watching anymore, they were a part of the spectacle, and they would want their share of the spotlight, their revenge for his newfound fame. The private sanctuary of the Lawson mansion was now a public stage. The miracle of Amanda's first steps was no longer their own, it belonged to the world. And the world, Richard knew, was a far more dangerous place than the streets Kola had come from. The headlines were a direct challenge to the power structure of Richard's company. David Morgan and Peter, his disgruntled partners, saw the media frenzy not as an opportunity, but as a liability. They were old school, men who believed in quiet power and controlled narratives. This emotional, public display was anathema to their business philosophy. They decided to act. They met in a secluded, unmarked office downtown, far from the cameras and the public eye. Their faces were grim. "This is not just about the government deal anymore," Morgan said, his voice a low growl. "He's making us all look weak. A billionaire being led around by a street boy. It's a joke. We have to show the board that we are still in control." Peter smiled, a cold, calculating expression. "We don't need to hurt the boy. We just need to remove him from the equation. He's Richard's weakness." We cut the weakness, we cut the problem. They knew of Tund. They had done their homework. Through a network of informants, they had learned about the street gang, their leader, and their recent meeting with Kola. They saw an opportunity to turn a problem into an asset. They hired a few low-level thugs, men who knew the streets and operated in the shadows, to contact Tund. The plan was simple: convince Tund that Richard Lawson was using Kola, exploiting him, and that they, the partners, were his only hope. They would orchestrate a rescue mission, kidnap Kola, and make it look like a street gang feud. The thugs met Tund in a dingy back alley. Tund, emboldened by the recent fame and his own bitterness, was more than willing to listen. The thugs offered him money, more than he had ever seen, and promised him revenge. "He's not a friend, Tund," one of the men said, a sinister smile on his face. "He's a puppet. We'll help you get him back. Get your money. Get your justice." Tund, blinded by greed and a twisted sense of loyalty, agreed. The plan was set in motion. The following evening, after the last rays of sun had dipped below the horizon, a black, unmarked van was seen idling near the Lawson mansion's less-used side gate. The gate, which was typically guarded, was strangely empty. Zara, who was still resentful and angry, had been promised a sum of money in exchange for a temporary malfunction of the security system. She had done her part. The kidnap attempt had begun. The evening had started like any other since Kola's arrival. After a quiet dinner, Amanda asked Kola to dance for her. She had been exhausted from the day's events, from the physical exertion of standing and the emotional strain of being a public figure. But watching Kola dance was her therapy. It was the only thing that made her feel whole. Kola, however, was distracted. He was still rattled by Tund's visit and the menacing threats. His movements lacked their usual grace and joy. He moved with a leaden heart, his eyes constantly darting toward the windows, a nervous energy thrumming just beneath his skin. Richard noticed the change. He saw the shadow of fear that had fallen over the boy. "What's wrong, Kola?" he asked, his voice low and concerned. "Are you all right?" Kola shook his head, unable to speak, the fear of Tund's words and the danger to Amanda weighing him down. He didn't want to get them involved. He thought if he could just keep his head down, the storm would pass. He was wrong. Just as he was about to begin his final move, a complex, high-flying spin he knew Amanda loved, the lights in the mansion flickered and died. The house was plunged into a sudden, inky darkness. A collective gasp went through the room. Richard immediately took out his phone, its flashlight illuminating the room in a single, narrow beam. Amidst the confusion, two figures, men in dark clothes, burst through the side door. They moved with a practiced ease, their faces hidden by balaclavas. The room erupted into chaos. Richard shouted, a protective roar. The men ignored him, their movements precise and quick. One of them grabbed Kola, clamping a hand over his mouth before he could scream. The other one grabbed Amanda's wheelchair, but she kicked and screamed, a fury she had never shown before. "No! Don't touch him!" Kola was dragged away, struggling, kicking, his mind racing with a mix of terror and understanding. It wasn't just Tund, it was something bigger, something orchestrated. The men moved him quickly, dragging him out the same door they had entered. His last sight was of Richard, his face illuminated by the phone's light, his eyes wide with horror. The last thing he heard was Amanda's scream, a primal, heart-wrenching sound that tore through the darkness. "Bring him back," she screamed, her voice breaking with agony. "Bring him back." The silence that followed was more deafening than the noise. The power returned, illuminating an empty doorway and a terrified, weeping child. Kola was gone. And in the silence of the mansion, Richard realized the true cost of their fragile hope. The silence in the mansion was broken by a single, shattering sound, the crash of a phone against the marble floor. Richard, a man who rarely lost his composure, was a portrait of a father undone. He knelt beside Amanda's wheelchair, his own body trembling with a rage he hadn't felt in years. Her tiny hands gripped his shirt, her face a mask of fear and raw desperation. "Bring him back, Daddy," she screamed, a plea that cut deeper than any knife. Richard stood, his mind now a laser-focused machine of action. He didn't call the police. The police would waste time on protocol, on jurisdiction, on paperwork. He knew this was a private matter, a targeted attack. He knew who was behind it. He looked at Mrs. Adele, his head of staff, who was already on the phone with the guards. "Cancel the call," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned to his chief of security, a former Special Forces operator named Mark. "I want every camera, every satellite image, every bit of data. Find that black van. Find it now." He didn't just have money, he had an intelligence network that rivaled some small countries. He was a man who planned for every contingency, and this was a contingency he was prepared to win. He put on a jacket, his movements sharp and deliberate. He would not wait for anyone. He would find Kola himself. He called David Morgan from his car, his voice cold and devoid of any emotion. "Did you think I wouldn't know?" he said. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Morgan's voice on the other end was a picture of feigned innocence. "Richard, I don't know what you're talking about." "I know what you and Peter did," Richard said, a chilling calm in his tone. "I know you orchestrated this. You think you've hurt me, but you've only made me stronger. You have no idea what you have just unleashed." He hung up, not waiting for a reply. He drove through the city, his focus unwavering. He used his connections to get access to traffic camera footage, tracking the black van with a grim certainty. He had never felt this kind of purpose before. He had always fought for money, for power, for status. But this was different. He was fighting for something real, something he was willing to lose everything for. He thought of his own daughter, of the silence she had lived in for so long, and of the boy who had brought her back to life. He wasn't just a boy. He wasn't a charity case. He was the son he never knew he needed. The rescue was a whirlwind of action and a blur of time. Richard, his security team, and a small, trusted group of men found the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He didn't wait for backup. He stormed the building, his mind a single-minded torrent of rage and determination. The thugs, surprised by the speed of his response, were no match for his team. They scattered into the night, but not before Kola was found, tied up and bruised, but alive. He was in rough shape. He had a gash on his forehead, his face was swollen, and his hands were raw from the rope. But his eyes, though filled with fear, held a fierce, unyielding light. Richard knelt beside him, a profound sense of relief washing over him. He was safe. He was alive. "I told you I'd come back," Kola whispered, his voice hoarse. Richard simply nodded, unable to speak, a tightness in his throat. He helped Kola to his feet, and they drove back to the mansion in a silent car, the sun rising over the city. The reunion was emotional and powerful. Amanda, who had refused to move from the spot where Kola had been taken, saw him first. She let out a cry of pure, unadulterated joy. She stumbled forward, pushing herself up from her wheelchair with a strength she didn't know she had, and ran to him. She didn't fall. She took her first steps with his help, her hands grasping his as he stumbled into the house, and together, they made it to the center of the living room, a place that now felt like a home. They were both bruised, both broken, but together, they were whole. Richard watched them, tears blurring his vision. He had risked everything for this moment. He had risked his business, his reputation, his very safety. And for the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of a return on investment. The return was not in money or power, but in the sight of his daughter standing, her face alight with happiness, and the realization that the boy, who had been a stranger, was now family. The next day, the mansion was a place of quiet celebration. Amanda, buoyed by the return of her friend and her own physical triumph, was more active than ever. She walked, with help from Cola, to the dining room for breakfast. The staff, their loyalties now firmly in favor of Cola, served them with smiles on their faces. It was a day of profound happiness and a fragile hope that the worst was over. But in the world of high finance, a betrayal was brewing. Peter, Richard's ruthless business partner, had a mole inside the Lawson household. Zara, the young housekeeper who had helped the kidnappers, was now a tool in his larger plan. She had been tasked with gathering information, with reporting on the comings and goings of the family. That morning, as she cleaned the study, she heard Richard talking on the phone. He was making arrangements for a meeting with his government contacts, planning to use the positive media attention around Cola and Amanda's story to secure his billion-dollar deal. Zara's eyes narrowed. Richard was winning. He had found the boy, and he was using the very thing they had tried to destroy to his advantage. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling with a mix of fear and a bitter, selfish greed. She sent a text message to the number Peter had given her. It was a single, cryptic message: "He's back. The meeting is set. Tomorrow at 10. The betrayal was a cold and simple act. Zara, driven by resentment and a promised reward, had given Peter the key to dismantling Richard's plan. The following day, Richard and his legal team walked into the high-stakes meeting with the government officials. They were confident, armed with a new, powerful narrative of social responsibility and community outreach, a direct result of Cola's influence. They presented their case, their pitch a masterful blend of corporate strategy and human kindness. The government officials listened, their faces impassive. As Richard finished, one of the officials leaned forward. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice grave. "We have received some disturbing information." He slid a file across the table. It contained a detailed, meticulously documented report. It had Cola's street name, a fabricated history of his supposed criminal activities, and a damning account of the orchestrated kidnapping. The report made it look like the entire event was a staged, pre-planned publicity stunt, a cynical attempt to use a boy's story to win a government contract. The final pages of the file were a photo of Zara leaving the house and a screenshot of the text message she had sent. The source was a leak from within the Lawson household. The betrayal from inside the mansion was now a public and corporate scandal. The celebration was over. The war had just begun. The leaked file hit the media with the force of a bomb. The government deal was dead. Richard walked out of the meeting, his face a mask of cold fury, the document a weight in his hands. The initial narrative of hope and charity was now a cynical tale of corporate manipulation. The public, so quick to embrace a hero, was just as quick to turn on a villain. The news outlets, once singing Richard's praises, now tore him apart. He was a fraud, a manipulator, a man who would use a child's suffering and a street boy's innocence for profit. The headlines were brutal. Lawson's miracle exposed. Was it a PR stunt? From hero to zero, Billionaire's charity is a lie. Richard's business partners, Morgan and Peter, held a press conference. They spoke with grave faces about the tragic betrayal of public trust and their moral obligation to distance themselves from a man who had staged a child's recovery for financial gain. They announced a hostile takeover, a vote to remove Richard from his own company. Inside the mansion, the world of television screens and newspapers felt a million miles away. Richard was on the phone with his lawyers, his security chief, his legal team. The house hummed with a different kind of tension now, one of a man preparing for a war he never wanted to fight. He saw the doubt in the eyes of some of his staff, a fear that they had been taken for fools. He knew the betrayal was from within. He had a suspect, but no proof. Kola, seeing the news, felt a new kind of fear. He had been a hero for a brief moment, but now he was a symbol of deceit, a boy whose story had been twisted into a weapon. He saw the worried glances of the staff, the way they avoided his eyes. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by an awkward silence. Richard found Amanda sitting in her room, a TV on with a news report. She was no longer crying, she was angry. "They're lying, Daddy," she said, her voice small but firm. "They're telling lies about you and Kola." Richard felt a profound sense of helplessness. He had built an empire on logic and strategy, but in the court of public opinion, emotion was the only currency. His reputation was in tatters, his legacy being rewritten in real time. He had a choice to make. He could fight back in the way he knew best, with lawyers, with press releases, with a corporate battle for his company. Or he could choose his daughter and the boy who had brought her back to life. He had to decide if business was worth everything he had just found. The day of the board meeting dawned, a day that would decide the fate of Richard Lawson and his company. Reporters and cameras had gathered outside the Lawson corporate building, a hungry, expectant crowd waiting for the final act of a public drama. Richard, in a tailored suit, was about to leave when he was stopped by a voice he hadn't expected to hear. "Wait, Daddy," Amanda said, her voice clear and strong. She was standing on her own, her hand gripping Kola's for balance. Kola had told her everything. He had told her about Tund, about the threats, about the kidnapping and the men who had planned it. He told her about the file, about the lie that had been created to destroy her father. She had listened, her small face filled with a grim determination. "I'm coming with you," she said. Richard's first instinct was to say no. It was too dangerous. The media would swarm them. It would be a circus. But he looked into her eyes and saw a strength that was unyielding. This wasn't just about business anymore, it was about their family. They arrived at the corporate building, and the crowd of reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in their faces, and questions were shouted. Richard held a hand up for silence. "I have no comment," he said, his voice a shield. "But my daughter does." The crowd quieted, their collective attention fixed on the small girl standing beside the towering billionaire and the barefoot street boy. Amanda took a deep breath. She looked at the cameras, her eyes filled with a fierce defiance. "My name is Amanda Lawson," she began, her voice small but growing with every word. "And I'm not a lie. I am not a business deal. I was in an accident, and it took my mom, and it took my voice, and it took my legs. The doctors said I would never walk again. But Kola, he didn't listen to the doctors. He listened to me." She looked at Kola, a small, genuine smile gracing her face. "He danced for me. He made me happy. And when he danced, I felt like I could move. My dad didn't use him. He saved him. And he saved me. Everything you're saying is a lie." She took a shaky step forward, then another, walking away from her father and toward the cameras. The crowd gasped. The media, who had come for a scandal, was now witnessing a miracle. Amanda continued, her voice growing in strength. "My dad almost lost everything to save Kola. He risked his life. That's not a business deal. That's love." The speech went viral in seconds. Videos of her walking and speaking were shared across the globe. The narrative shifted again, a seismic change in public perception. The court of public opinion had a new verdict. The miracle was real. The boy was a hero. And Richard Lawson was a man who had chosen his family over his fortune. The viral video of Amanda's speech was a powerful blow to Morgan and Peter's hostile takeover. The board, influenced by the dramatic turn of public opinion, postponed the vote. But it was a temporary reprieve, not a victory. Richard was still a man under siege. He had lost the government deal, his stock was still volatile, and his partners were now more determined than ever to destroy him. They used their connections, their wealth, and their influence to launch a new, more vicious attack. They leaked sensitive, private information about his past deals, painting him as a ruthless, unethical businessman. They paid people to testify against him in the media, to spin stories of his cold-hearted business practices. They attacked his core. The pressure mounted. Richard, a man who had always prided himself on his control, was losing it. He was sleeping less, eating less. His calm facade was cracking. He was fighting battles on every front, against his partners, against the media, against his own exhaustion. The day after Amanda's speech, he received a phone call from the head of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, a deal that had been in the works for months. Richard, the man's voice was full of regret. "I'm sorry. We can't move forward with the acquisition. The board is concerned about your public image. We can't be associated with this kind of drama. It's too risky." The words hit Richard with the weight of a physical blow. He had just lost $1 billion deal. The company he had spent his life building was crumbling. The money he had fought so hard for, the power he had craved, was slipping through his fingers. He looked at the vast, empty rooms of his mansion, a monument to a life he was about to lose. That evening, he sat alone in his office, the city lights a distant, shimmering blur. He felt a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had saved Cola. He had seen his daughter walk. But at what cost? He had lost everything. The question, a painful, bitter thought, echoed in the silence of his mind. Is kindness worth everything I've lost? The question lingered in Richard's mind, a painful echo in the quiet of his office. He had sacrificed everything for Cola and Amanda, and yet, he felt more alone and defeated than ever. The weight of his losses, the company, the deal, his reputation, felt heavier than the joy of his daughter's recovery. He was a man who had chosen love, and in return, he felt he had been ruined. The next morning was different. It was a day that started with a stillness that felt profound. The usual frantic energy of the house was gone. There were no lawyers on the phone, no journalists at the gate. Richard walked out of his office, his face haggard, and found Amanda sitting in the garden, a book in her lap. But she wasn't in her wheelchair. She was sitting in a simple wooden chair, her feet on the grass. Cola was there too, practicing his dance, his movements less a performance and more a silent prayer. He was a shadow of his former self, his face drawn from the stress and the constant fear. He had been staying awake at night, listening for any sound, any sign of danger. He was exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and a fierce loyalty to the family that had become his own. Amanda looked up from her book, her eyes full of a love that was both fierce and innocent. She smiled at her father, a genuine, joyful smile that lit up her face. "Daddy, look," she said, her voice full of a child's simple triumph. She put the book down, and without any hesitation, she stood up. She took a step, then another. She walked toward him, her movements hesitant at first, then growing more confident with each stride. She wasn't holding on to anything. She was walking, unaided, a miracle on 2 feet. Her smile was so bright, so full of life, that it felt like the sun itself had come to rest in the garden. Tears streamed down Richard's face. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the moment he had almost given up on. This was the result of a boy's joy, a father's despair, and a daughter's courage. He felt the bitterness and the anger melt away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The billionaire deals, the public scandals, the corporate betrayals, none of it mattered. This was the true wealth. This was his treasure. Amanda reached him, throwing her arms around him in a tight hug. In that moment, the entire world disappeared. It was just the three of them, a father, a daughter, and a boy who had brought a broken family back to life. Richard held her tight, a sob escaping his lips. He looked at Cola, a silent message of thanks passing between them. But as he looked, he saw Cola's eyes roll back in his head. The boy swayed, his body giving out from the stress, the sleepless nights, and the emotional toll. He collapsed from exhaustion, a silent testament to the price he had paid for their happiness. Cola was rushed to the hospital. Richard didn't leave his side, sitting in the sterile waiting room, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The doctors assured him it was just a severe case of exhaustion and malnutrition, but Richard saw it for what it was, a consequence of his own choices. He had brought this boy into his world, into the line of fire, and the boy had paid the price. As he waited for Cola to wake, he had a visitor. It was David Morgan, his former partner, his face a grim mask of defeat. The public had turned on them, disgusted by their ruthless corporate maneuvering in the face of a child's miracle. Morgan's hostile takeover had failed. He had lost everything. "I was wrong, Richard," Morgan said, his voice a low, bitter admission. "I thought you were a fool. I thought you were weak for choosing that boy over the company. But I was the fool. The public has spoken. You had the golden touch all along. Not for money, but for people. It's a far more powerful currency." Richard looked at him, feeling no sense of triumph. He was a man who had built an empire on transactions, on cost-benefit analyses, on risk and reward. But the true reward, he realized, was not in a bank account. It was in the sight of his daughter walking, in the life of a boy who had taught him how to love. He looked at Cola, sleeping in the hospital bed, a peaceful expression on his face. He saw not a street boy or a charity case, but a son. A son who had come to him barefoot and hungry and had, in turn, given him a family. Richard walked out of the hospital room, his mind clear for the first time in years. He called his legal team. He gave them a new instruction, a task that had nothing to do with corporate takeovers or billion-dollar deals. He wanted adoption papers drafted. He wanted Cola to be a Lawson. He wanted to give him a name, a family, and a future. He saw the papers on his desk, an elegant, simple document that would rewrite destinies. His signature, the same one that had closed countless deals, now had a new, profound purpose. The question, "Is kindness worth everything I've lost?" had an answer. A resounding yes. The adoption was a quiet, private affair. The media had moved on, and the court of public opinion was finally at peace. The Lawson mansion, once a monument to grief, was now a home. It was filled with the sound of laughter, the pitter-patter of tiny feet, and the beautiful, complex choreography of a family that had been forged in fire. Cola, no longer a street boy, was now Cola Lawson. He had his own room, a closet full of clean clothes, and a future filled with possibility. He would never be hungry or cold again. But more than that, he had a father who loved him and a sister who adored him. He still danced, but it was different now. It was a dance of pure joy, a celebration of a life he never thought he would have. One afternoon, Richard found Amanda and Cola on the terrace. Amanda was walking unaided, her steps still a little shaky, but full of confidence. Cola was teaching her a new dance move, a graceful spin that made her laugh. Richard watched them, a profound sense of peace washing over him. He had everything he had ever wanted, and it had come to him not through his wealth, but through his love. He had won a different kind of deal. A deal for a family. A deal for a second chance. He looked at his daughter, her face radiant with happiness, and at his son, his eyes filled with a peace that was new and deserved. He was no longer a cold tycoon, he was a father, a man who had found his true fortune. He had learned a profound truth. The world had told him that the richest gifts came from the highest places, from power, from influence, from a bank account. But he had learned a different lesson, a lesson taught to him by a barefoot boy with a golden heart. He looked at his children, his heart full, and knew it was true. Sometimes the richest gifts come from the poorest hands.